Hi everyone, Mrs. Reddy here with a short PowerPoint on sources of presidential power. To begin with, just remember that the Founding Fathers wanted to establish an office in the presidency that would balance the exercise of authority with the preservation of the rights and the will of the people. Okay, we're going to start with expressed powers. And expressed powers are the ones that we know are in the Constitution. Some common express powers are Commander-in-Chief, the President's power to appoint heads of executive departments, appoint ambassadors, and as you see in the picture here, appointing Supreme Court justices. This is a picture of George Bush appointing John Roberts as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Pardon crimes, remember Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for the crimes committed during Watergate. Presidents enter into treaties, give the State of the Union address every January, and receive ambassadors. All right, next we're going to talk about inherent powers. Inherent powers are implied powers. When you think that go along hand in hand with being president. When you think of inherent powers with Congress, you think of the necessary and proper clause, which gives implied powers to Congress. Remember, that clause says Congress has the power to make any law necessary and proper, carrying out its enumerated powers. Well, the president doesn't have a necessary and proper clause. Instead, the president has, for the implied powers that are implied by the expressed powers in the Constitution, the president has the take care clause, which gives presidents powers not expressly granted by the Constitution. And the take care clause says he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So this has been used to assert additional powers. An example of this is when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a strong states' rights advocate, and limited government against a strong central government. And yet he took a very bold move by making the Louisiana Purchase. There was nothing in the Constitution that gave him that power to do that. But he also felt that if he waited around for Congress to authorize an amendment to make the transaction, it would never happen, and the opportunity would be lost. So he forged ahead with the purpose, and luckily there were no negative consequences to that action. FDR also used inherent or implied powers when he expanded the size and power of the federal government with his New Deal programs during the 30s. George Bush, W. Bush, used inherent powers when he suspended the civil liberties of foreign nationals that were held in military prison at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay. They've been detained indefinitely for questioning about possible terrorist activities. Okay, next we have statutory powers. These are powers that are granted by Congress. So basically, congressional action, making a law that gives the president extra powers. Superpowers. For example, the 1996 Line Item Veto Act was an example of granted powers by Congress to the president, and it's also an example of checks and balances because the Supreme Court declared this act to be unconstitutional, exercising the power of judicial review. So we have a lot of examples with the Line Item Veto Act. After statutory powers, we have special presidential powers, and those include executive orders, emergency powers, and executive privilege. So let's look at each of those. Executive orders, the classic example of an executive order is when Truman integrated the military. That was done by executive order. And this gives his direction to the military to integrate the armed forces. Executive orders have the force of law, are issued by the president, and are used for the following: to create or change regulatory guidelines of an executive department or agency. So directions to one of the departments or agencies within the executive branch. to enforce specific provisions of the Constitution, to enforce Supreme Court rulings, and we have the example of Truman and the integration of the military, and Obama closing Guantanamo Bay, even though it's still open. These executive orders have very few limits or stipulations. One limitation on executive orders is that presidents cannot use them to create new taxes or appropriate funds. Those powers are reserved to Congress. Okay, moving ahead to emergency powers. These are broad powers exercised by presidents during times of national crisis. We have the example of Lincoln during the Civil War, when he used emergency powers to suspend the civil liberties of alleged agitators, to draft state militia units into national service, and to federalize the governing of the southern states. FDR used emergency powers in 1936 when a corporation in the United States was charged with conspiring to sell 15 machine guns to Bolivia. Now, I don't know any details about that, except that it was in violation of a joint resolution from Congress. So, without congressional approval, Franklin Roosevelt ordered an embargo on the machine gun shipment. An embargo means a government order that makes or limits trade. A government order that limits trade. Last of all is executive privilege. We see Richard Nixon here. We know that he claimed executive privilege during the Watergate scandal, refusing to turn over tapes that might incriminate him. Authority of the president to refuse to disclose confidential information to Congress or the courts. In this instance, Nixon was not successful. The claim for using executive privilege is separation of powers. So the concept that the White House is independent of the other branches and that the president has the right to privacy. The courts have limited use of this power when presidents try to cover up misdeeds by members of the executive branch. In other words, they've said you can't claim executive privilege when it's a cover-up of misdeeds. An example of this is when Bill Clinton tried to prevent White House aides from testifying before Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Remember, he was accused of having extramarital relations with Lewinsky, who was a White House aide, and the courts compelled those aides to testify. In general, executive privilege, where there's a clear issue of separation of powers, has been allowed. It is limited when presidents have tried to prevent the revelation or have tried to cover up misdeeds by members of the executive branch. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.